At first glance, the satellite image looks like nothing more than an empty desert. But right in the middle of this barren landscape, something unusual appears. Zoom in closer, and you'll notice it, an aircraft carrier. Not floating in the ocean, but sitting right here in the desert sands. This isn't a mirage. It's real. The image was captured over the Taklamakan Desert in northwestern China. Normally, aircraft carriers sail across rough seas, but this region, while bone dry, is just as unforgiving. The Taklamakan itself is extraordinary. Unlike rocky deserts, it's made entirely of sand, endless dunes that make it the second largest sand desert in the world. Vast, isolated, and almost alien, it stretches across the land like a giant eye carved from the earth. So why would China build massive carrier-shaped structures here, in one of the most remote places on the planet? In recent years, China has been making waves with its growing aircraft carrier program. Its first domestically built carrier is already in service, and in just 15 years, China has gone from having none to 3. But here's the twist: when we study this desert structure more closely, something doesn't add up. The design doesn't resemble China's own carriers at all. Instead, it looks strikingly similar to the US Navy's Gerald R. a Ford-class carrier, the most advanced in America's fleet. And that's not all. Just beyond this site, cutting across the desert, we can see a set of train tracks. On the other side, another shape emerges. This one isn't a carrier. It's the outline of a US Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, one of the Navy's most powerful and widely used warships. The resemblance is uncanny, from the bridge and funnels to the exact layout of the vertical launch system used for missiles. But look closer, this isn't a real warship. It's a flat, simplified mock-up. A replica built to mirror the original. And if we roll back the satellite images, the mystery deepens. In 2020, the site appeared as nothing more than a grid of cubes, with tall structures that look like masts or antennas, arranged perfectly in the shape of the American destroyer. Do you want me to build more suspense in the next parts, like a mystery? Only later, the full outline of the ship was marked more clearly. The aircraft carrier shape also appears to be just a mock-up. Here, older satellite images show that this spot originally had a different layout, featuring 3 distinct shapes, a small and a medium-sized outline of an aircraft carrier and the largest version drawn with those tall metal poles. And when we look again at the train tracks running through the middle, we can see just how strange they are. Instead of running straight, the track curves and twists before making a sharp right turn. This is odd because the surrounding desert is completely flat land, so there are absolutely no natural obstacles that would require these turns. Why wasn't the track built in a straight line? And it gets even stranger when we follow where these tracks lead. Heading north, they come to a stop at a base facility with a large hangar, a few supporting buildings and a lot of trucks nearby. And when following the tracks the other way heading south, they simply vanish into the desert as the tracks just end, with no sign of ongoing construction and no clear purpose. To get close to understanding why China is doing all of this, it's helpful to take a look at where the real counterparts of these mock-up ships are located, because it turns out US aircraft carriers often aren't as far away from this desert as one might think. The United States has once again deployed an aircraft carrier to the South China Sea. And just recently, a Chinese warship nearly collided with an American destroyer. These waters have been a flashpoint for years, with US and Chinese vessels locked in a dangerous game of cat and mouse. At the heart of this confrontation are 2 volatile flashpoints, the South China Sea and Taiwan. In the South China Sea, China claims almost the entire ocean as its own, dismissing international waters and overlapping claims from its neighbors. To enforce this, it has built military outposts on artificial islands, turning reefs and sandbars into fortified bases. The US, refusing to accept this, sends its carriers and destroyers through these waters. These freedom of navigation patrols are a direct challenge to China's expanding grip. But that's only part of the story. The other front is Taiwan. Beijing views the island as a breakaway province. Taiwan, meanwhile, functions as an independent nation, with its own government and military. The possibility of China invading is real, and the US Navy maintains a constant presence nearby to deter it. And this brings us back to the desert. Those strange carrier and destroyer mock-ups? They aren't symbolic. Their targets. China is using its deserts as proving grounds, testing whether its missiles can actually hit US warships. Those tall metal poles scattered around the mock-ups? Some analysts believe they're sensors, recording missile impacts. Others think they're radar reflectors, designed to make the fake ships behave like real ones under radar, so missile guidance systems can be tested. And it isn't theory anymore. Satellite images from other test sites confirm China has already struck its targets. But here's the catch. Hitting a stationary hulk in the desert is one thing. Hitting a carrier weaving through open water is another. That's why the desert train tracks matter. When we follow them, we find another carrier mock-up, this one far more detailed, built in 3 dimensions, with rows of poles mimicking the complex shape of a real ship. Photos from a Chinese arms expo even reveal a scale model of this exact system, developed by weapons giant KSIC. The curved rails allow the carrier mock-up to move, simulating evasive maneuvers at sea, swerving, accelerating, and trying to dodge incoming fire. And once again, satellite images show that these moving target tests have been successful. China isn't the first to do this. Back in 2014, Iran famously built a fake US carrier, sailed it into the Gulf, and blasted it apart in a made-for-TV exercise. And the US itself trains the same way, building entire mock towns in the desert, flying against replicas of Chinese J-20 stealth fighters, and even operating real Russian MiGs for training. But what makes China's tests uniquely alarming is the weapon they're designed for. The Dongfeng 21D. A missile that US intelligence calls the carrier killer. Unlike a cruise missile or a torpedo, this is a ballistic missile. It arcs high into the atmosphere, then plunges back down at blistering speeds. But here's the terrifying part, its warhead is maneuverable. During re-entry, it can change course, zigzag, and lock onto moving ships. Even an aircraft carrier steaming at full speed, China has paired this with an expanding satellite network, giving it the ability to track ships in real time. Defending against such a weapon is incredibly difficult. Conventional missile shields can't easily intercept a target moving unpredictably at hypersonic speed. And perhaps most telling of all, China isn't hiding this. These desert mock-ups are clearly visible to satellites, which suggests they want the world to see. Because the very existence of these weapons changes the equation. If the US can't bring its carriers close to China without risking annihilation, those carriers lose their value in a Taiwan or South China Sea conflict. China doesn't even need to fire the missile, the threat alone shifts the balance of power. Taiwan knows this. It recently held massive drills simulating a Chinese invasion, mobilizing over 22,000 reservists. And yet, this entire story has barely broken into mainstream headlines in the US. But make no mistake, the world's most powerful weapon at sea now has a direct countermeasure. And China is making sure everyone knows it. War is no longer just fought on seas or skies, it's fought in deserts and in the shadows of technology. China's desert carriers aren't just mock-ups. They're warnings. Are US carriers still untouchable, or has China found their weak spot? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the weapons shaping tomorrow's battlefield. This is War Technology. Decoding the future of war. Until next time, stay sharp.